Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. So in today's video we shall consider the next part of the respiratory system, that is the pharynx. Okay, so as you are familiar with this particular slide which shows the different parts of the respiratory system. So in the last video we have considered the nose, which is the entrance for the air which we inhale. Okay, so we shall consider the next part today, that is the pharynx, or it is also known as throat. This is the one. Okay, now this particular pharynx, it is also known as throat, as we have seen. So if you can see the shape of this particular organ, so it begins at this particular point. Now what is this point? As we have seen in the last lecture, that's the internal nares, that is the opening of the nasal cavity into the pharynx. Okay, so this is the starting point where the pharynx begins, okay, and it ends at this particular point. Okay, so this particular entire portion, as you can see, that it's roughly in the shape of a funnel, right? Okay, so it's a funnel shaped tube with the dimensions of about 13 centimeters. So it's 13 centimeter long. So as depicted earlier, it begins at the internal nares and it extends up to the cricoid cartilage. Okay, so this is the most inferior cartilage of the larynx. Okay, so this is your larynx and that's the cricoid cartilage. So up to here extends the larynx. So as you can see, the location of the pharynx, it's just posterior to the nasal cavity and the oral cavities. Okay, and it lies superior to the larynx, right? So it's just above the larynx, which is the next part of the respiratory system, and anterior to the cervical vertebrae. These are your cervical vertebrae, right? So just anterior to that lies the pharynx. So that's the position of the pharynx. Okay, now the wall of the pharynx, it is mainly composed of the skeletal muscles. So will it be voluntary or involuntary, the contractions of this pharynx, wall of pharynx? Yes, it will be voluntary in nature, right, because it comprises of the skeletal muscles. Okay, and internally it is lined with a mucous membrane. Okay, so these skeletal muscles, they remain relaxed, and because of this it keeps the pharynx patent. Now what is the meaning of patent? Patent means open. Okay, so as you can see, it doesn't collapse. Okay, so because the skeletal muscles which are located in the walls of this pharynx, it remains relaxed, it will keep this pharynx patent, that is, it will prevent it from collapsing. Okay, now the muscles throughout the pharynx, these are arranged in two layers. Okay, so the outer layer, it comprises of circularly arranged muscles, and the inner layer, it comprises of the muscles which are arranged in the longitudinal layer. Now these particular muscles, skeletal muscles, these are voluntary in nature, right? So they will help in the process of deglutation. If you can recall, deglutation means swallowing. That's the act of swallowing, wherein the food which has entered the mouth, it will enter into the esophagus. That's the esophagus, right? Okay, so the food which is present in the mouth, it will be swallowed, it will move towards the esophagus, from here it will move towards the stomach. So that's the process of deglutation, and that is made possible by the contraction of these skeletal muscles which are present in the walls of the pharynx. Okay, so now what are the functions of this particular organ? Okay, coming to the functions of the pharynx. So pharynx, it will act as a passageway for both air as well as food, because the air which enters your respiratory system through the nose, okay, so it will enter into the nasal cavity. From here it will move towards the pharynx, and from here it will enter into the next part, that is the larynx. Whereas the food, it is entering into the esophagus. So the necessary arrangements are made. Now why do you think the food which you eat, it doesn't enter the larynx? Okay, now why that's happening is because of the arrangement of this epiglottis. Okay, so it closes off this opening of the larynx, so that the food which you swallow, it should not go into the larynx, but it should go into the esophagus. By mistake, if it enters into the larynx, you will cough it out. Okay, so it acts as a passageway for both the air as well as food. So it's a part of both the respiratory system as well as the digestive system. Apart from that, it provides a resonating chamber for speech sounds. So variations in the sounds as you speak, so that's made possible because of the pharynx. It acts as a resonating chamber. So also it houses the tonsils. Okay, there are tonsils, pharyngeal tonsils are present. Okay, then the lingual tonsils are present over here, palatine tonsils are present. Okay, so these tonsils, they are the part of immunity. Okay, so they participate in the immunological reactions against any foreign substances which are entering the body. Okay, now coming to the anatomy of this pharynx. Okay, so pharynx, anatomically it is divided into three regions, that is nasopharynx, oropharynx and laryngopharynx. So these are the three parts. So in the digestive system also we have seen these three parts of the pharynx. So we have seen that there are two parts out of this which are the part of digestive system. Can you all recall which are the two parts which belong to the digestive system out of these three? Yes, it is the oropharynx, that's the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx, which form the part of digestive system as well. Okay, no doubt it is a part of respiratory system, but it is also the part of digestive system, that is your food which you are swallowing, it will enter into the oropharynx. It is known as oropharynx because it is associated with the oral cavity. So it will enter into the oropharynx. From here it will go into the laryngopharynx. So this part is associated with the larynx, that's why it is called as laryngopharynx, and from here it will move into the esophagus. Okay, so these two portions, the food should not move into the nasopharynx. Does it move? No, it does not, because as you swallow this particular part, uvula and the soft palate, they are lifted upwards to close off the nasopharynx, so that the food which you swallow, it will enter only into the esophagus. Also the epiglottis, it closes off the larynx so that it should not enter into your respiratory system. Okay, so these are the three regions of the pharynx. So these are also depicted over here. The one which is shown yellow in color, that's nasopharynx, the blue in color, that is oropharynx, and the pink in color, which is laryngopharynx. Okay, so they are named according to which part it is associated. Okay, so nasopharynx, it is associated with nose. Oropharynx, it is associated with oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, it is associated with the larynx. Okay. Now, coming to each of these parts. Now, the superior portion, topmost portion of the pharynx, that is known as the nasopharynx. So, it lies just posterior to your nasal cavity. That's your nasal cavity. So, just posterior to that lies the nasopharynx. Okay, and it extends up to the soft palate. Where is the soft palate? Soft palate forms the posterior roof of the oral cavity, right? That's the soft palate. So, it will extend up to here. So, this particular portion is the nasopharynx. Okay, so soft palate, that's the posterior portion of the roof of your mouth, as we have seen. So, it's a arch shaped muscular partition between the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. Okay, so this is lined by the mucous membrane. Now, coming to the openings into this particular portion, that is the nasopharynx. So, there are in all 5 openings in the walls of the nasopharynx. Okay. First of all, there are 2 internal nares, right? Okay, there are 2 partitions of your nose, right? Externally as well as internally. So, there are 2 internal nares which will open into the nasopharynx. There are also 2 openings which leads to the auditory tube or pharyngotympanic tube, as it is called, as commonly known as the Eustachian tubes. You all must have heard it. Okay, so that's the opening of your auditory tube or Eustachian tube. It's opening into your nasopharynx. So there will be 2, okay, for either sides of your ears, right and left ear. So also there is the opening into the oropharynx, which is the next part, right, this one. So that's the 5th opening. 2 internal nares, 2 openings of the auditory tube, and the 1 opening towards the oropharynx. Okay. Now, in the posterior wall of this nasopharynx lies the tonsils, that is the pharyngeal tonsils, or it is also known as adenoid. Okay. These are present in the posterior wall of the nasopharynx. Okay. So, this particular part, it receives the air which is being breathed in. Okay, so it is receiving the air which you breathe in, which has entered your nasal cavity. So, it will enter further into the nasopharynx. So, also it will also receive the dust laden mucus. Remember, the mucus, it traps all the dust particles, right? So, that mucus will also enter into the nasopharynx. So, from here it can be either it will enter into the oropharynx, it can be swallowed or it can be spitted out. Okay, so thus it will prevent any kind of dust particles entering into your respiratory system. So, that is a protective function. Okay. Now, this nasopharynx, the mucous membrane of the nasopharynx, it is lined with the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So, also are present the cilia. Okay. So, cilia, they can beat in a specific direction, right. So, these cilia which are present in this particular region into the mucous membrane, it moves the mucus down towards the most inferior part of your pharynx. So these cilia will beat in inward direction so that the mucus will travel in the inward direction. So from here it can be either swallowed or it will be thrown out through the mouth. Okay, so it is not traveling into your respiratory system, but it is removed out from the pharynx. Okay, now apart from that, the nasopharynx also exchanges the air with the auditory tubes, that is the Eustachian tube. Okay, so these are the openings, right, on either sides. So through these openings, the air which is present in the nasopharynx, so that is also exchanged with the auditory tubes. So this will help in equalizing the air pressures between the pharynx and the middle ear. Okay, so you all must have experienced this. Sometimes the pressure inside your ear increases, right? So what happens? You are not able to hear properly. So what happens when you swallow the saliva? Sometimes that air pressure is relieved. Okay, so that's because of the adjustments of the air in between these two portions, that is the nasopharynx and the auditory tubes. Okay, now coming to the next part of the pharynx, that is the intermediate portion or the middle portion, that is known as the oropharynx, as it is associated with the oral cavity. So it lies just posterior to the oral cavity. So it extends from the soft palate, that's the one. So it extends from the soft palate inferiorly to the level of the hyoid bone. Okay, so it will extend somewhere up to over here. Okay, so that's your hyoid bone, right? This is the one. So up to the level of this particular bone extends the oropharynx, from the soft palate up to the level of the hyoid bone. Now this particular portion, it has only one opening into it, that is the fauces. Fauces means throat. Okay, remember the opening of the oral cavity into the oropharynx, that is known as the fauces. That's the one. So this portion, okay, wherein that's the tongue. So that's your oral cavity. So it opens into the oropharynx through this small opening called as fauces. Okay, now this particular part of the pharynx, that is the oropharynx. So this is the portion which belongs to both the systems, that is the respiratory system as well as the digestive system. So it has both the respiratory functions as well as digestive functions. So it will convey both the air as well as the food and drinks, right, but in the appropriate parts. So accordingly the arrangements are made so that the air, it enters into your larynx and the food, it enters into the esophagus. Okay, so both the functions are carried out by this particular portion, oropharynx. Okay, now this particular portion, it is subjected to the abrasion. So now as you can see that the food from the mouth, it will enter into the esophagus through this particular portion, right? So the mucous membrane which is lining this particular portion of the pharynx, so it will be subjected to abrasions by the food particles, because the food particles are still large enough, right? So as they pass through this pharynx, they may damage the cells, right? So that is the reason why the cells which are lining this oropharynx, they comprise of the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium to bear the wear and tear because of the passage of the food particles which are large enough. Okay. Apart from that, there are two pairs of tonsils also which are present, that is the palatine tonsils and the lingual tonsils. Okay, so they are paired in nature, one on either side. Okay, so that's the palatine tonsil. Okay, so we have seen the location of this palatine tonsils also, and apart from that, one more type of tonsil, that is the lingual tonsil, is also present. So these are paired in nature on either sides. Okay, so these are located in the oropharynx. Then the inferior portion of the pharynx, that is known as the laryngopharynx, or it is also known as hypopharynx. Now this particular portion, it begins at the level of hyoid bone. So that's the level up to where the oropharynx extends, right? So from here begins the next part, the last part, that is the laryngopharynx. And at its inferior end, that is over here, it has two openings. Okay, so posteriorly it will open into the esophagus, that's a food pipe, and anteriorly it will open into the next part of the respiratory system, that is the larynx. So it has two openings. Okay, so again this particular part, laryngopharynx, just like your oropharynx, it also belongs to both these systems, right? Respiratory as well as digestive pathway. Okay, because it will help in conveying both the air which is entering from the nasopharynx as well as the food which is entering from the oral cavity in the appropriate parts. So oropharynx as well as laryngopharynx, both are the parts of respiratory system as well as the digestive system. So this particular portion, that is the laryngopharynx, the mucous membrane again is lined by non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Now what is the reason for that? Yes, we have seen that oropharynx is also lined by the same type of cells, right, in the epithelium. That's because again it is subjected to the wear and tear or abrasion by the food particles which are entering over here. So that is the reason why it is made up of the non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Okay, so these are the three regions into which the pharynx is divided into. Okay, so we have seen the pharynx, which is the second part of the respiratory system. So air which you breathe into your nose, it will enter into the pharynx, and it has three parts, that is the nasopharynx, which is the superior portion, the oropharynx, which is the intermediate portion, and the laryngopharynx, which is the inferior portion. Okay, so it will convey the air towards the larynx, which is the next part of the respiratory system. Also the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, these are the parts of digestive system as well. So they will help in conveying the food into the esophagus. Okay, so this is the reference. Thank you for watching.